How do you find the love of your life?
That's a good question. I was asked that multiple times. I didn't have a good answer, and then I thought, why don't I have a good answer? I thought, oh, I know why. Because that's a stupid question. So why?
Yeah.
Why? Because it's putting the cart before the horse. Here's the right question. How do I make myself into the perfect date? You answer that question, and you will not have any problem answering the previous question. It's like, what do I want in a partner? If I offered everything I could to a partner, who would I be? You work on that. Ask that question. Just ask. Just ask yourself, okay, I have to be the person that women would want. Okay, what do they want? Clean. That's not a bad start. Reasonably good physical shape. So healthy, productive, generous, honest, willing to delay gratification. So you dance with a woman. It's like, what's she doing? What are you two doing? Well, it's a pattern. There's patterns happening around you. That's the music. Patterns. Patterns of being. That's the music. Now, can you align yourself with the patterns of being gracefully? That's what she's checking out. And then can you do that with her? And then can you do that in a playful and attentive manner and keep your bloody hands to yourself for at least a minute? And so, can you dance in a playful manner? It's like you can go through this in your imagination. And you'll know. And then you think, well, how far am I from those things? And the answer is usually, man, it's a pretty horrible abyss separating you from that ideal. But the harder you work on offering other people what they need and want, the more people will line up to play with you. So it's the wrong question. It's like, how can I be the best partner possible? And then you think, well, if I do that, people will just take advantage of me. And that's the non-naive objection, right? Because the naive person saying, well, I'll be good and everyone will treat me right. It's like the cynic says, no, I'll be good and someone will take me out. And then you think, well, what do you do about that objection? And the answer is, well, you factor that in. And that's why you're supposed to be as soft as a dove and as wise as a serpent. It's like, I know you're full of snakes. I know it. Maybe I know it more than you do, but we'll play anyways. And that's
the risk anyway.
That's right, voluntarily, right? And what's so cool about that is that even though the person you're dealing with is full of snakes, if you offer your hand in trust and it's real, you will evoke the best in them. I think that people are having a harder time finding, like, let's call them more permanent relationships, is because it's become increasingly easy to have fleeting, casual, sexual relationships. I mean, Tinder is a revolution, right? It's a revolution in sexual behavior.
The technology has enabled this fleeting sexual activity.
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. And that's, but we don't want to underestimate how radical a technology that is. That's right. Especially for men.
I do feel that deep down that all these people, men and women alike, are always longing for something more meaningful.
Well, I think that that's generally the case. I mean, part of the reason for a relationship is sexual contact, obviously. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily need a relationship for that. But that's not the reason to be with someone. The reason to be with someone, well, there's a lot of them. So one is, well, kids who have two parents do far better, period. Data on that is crystal clear. Doesn't mean that there aren't many single parents who struggle to do a wonderful job. Yeah. That's not the same thing. It's an average issue. Plus, it's a lot of work to have kids. You know, you kind of need to divide up the labor, especially in the first year or two, you know, because a woman is completely overwhelmed in the first year and she needs somebody around to take care of her while she's taking care of the kid, fundamentally, or at least that's the way it looks to me. So there's that. You need the stable basis for children, and it takes them a long time to mature, and they need to learn that relationships are trustworthy, right? Mm-hmm. So there's utility and stability there. But then also, you kind of want to tangle your life together with someone, you know, because you have someone it's like two ropes that are tangled together. It's stronger, especially during times of weakness. And you have two brains instead of one. And that actually turns out to be really helpful when things are complicated. And it builds a solidity into your life and a reality into your life to have someone who's along with you on this very long voyage. And so I think that deepens your life in a way that isn't really possible with fragmentary relationships as a single person. And then there's more to it than that. It's like, I think of wrestling. There's this scene in the Old Testament where Jacob wrestles with an angel. He's wrestling with God, actually, which is quite an interesting. But I think of marriage the same way. Like, people think, well, they lived happily ever after. It's like, that's not what you want in a marriage. Yeah. You want someone to contend with, you know, because you learn through that wrestling. You learn where you're an idiot and where you should stop being. and vice versa. So that's the spiritual aspect of marriage. It's the fact that you have to contend with someone under all sorts of circumstances. Theoretically, it's a manner of promoting psychological, or you could say spiritual growth, and it's genuine. That's why marriage is a sacrament in most human communities, right? It's stamped both by the state and by the sacred authorities, because it's not just a physiological union. That's what animals do, and there's nothing wrong with the physiological union, but it has to be placed in the context of everything else a human being is. And I do think it's dreadful for people not to have that.
I thank God that I'm not dating now, because I feel like it seems like it's miserable out there right now.
Well, it's
to try to meet people.
It is hard although, it's easier to meet people because there's more ways of meeting them.
Right.
But the ways of meeting them are more shallow. In my clinical practice, I would say that the rise of the internet dating option has actually overall been good for people who are looking for a partner. Now, there is some speculation and some evidence that it lowers the transaction price of separation and divorce. Because one of the reasons you don't separate or you don't get divorced is you're going to find someone else. And if it's easier to find someone else, then perhaps you're more tempted to sever the relationship. So maybe you lose in one place where you gain in the other. But I think there are different kinds of hard that it is. It's hard for couples to figure out how to manage two careers. It's hard for women to figure out how to get educated and get their career launched at the same time that they're finding a partner and having kids. Because women have this tight time frame, they've got to get a lot done by the time they're mid-30s for sure. And so it's not much time, it's like 15 years really from the time you're an adult. You better get at it. It's not very long.
Right.
So I think there are new challenges that have arisen that weren't there for previous generations. But previous generations had it hard in other ways.
That's true, yeah.
If you live by yourself, you can do everything the way you would want.
Yeah.
If you live with someone else, then there's compromises to make.
Yes.
But in the long picture, it's better for you.
Well, that's it. There's sacrifices to be made in the short term. And people have to. The effort issue is when you're in love with someone, you're going to organize your schedule and make them a priority. And, that's in some ways a fleeting state, although it's not necessarily as fleeting as people think it is, but whatever. It's obviously a priority. And then you get married and, you kind of get accustomed to having each other around, and then everything else is more important and the relationship drifts to the bottom. And then people get dissatisfied and they start looking for excitement and adventure otherwise. Well, you can't do that. You have to prioritize the relationship. My observation clinically has been, for a couple to maintain their relationship without it deteriorating, they have to spend 90 minutes a week together talking about their lives, about how the house is run, about what they've all been doing, to keep their stories caught up, right? It's not that much.
Yeah.
And which is a good thing. You can actually do it. And then they need to spend at least one time having a date. And 2 is better. 1 is necessary. 2 is better. You can't aim for a lot more than that because, life is very busy, and if it's going to be sustainable, it has to be realistic. But they need to make time for each other twice a week and talk in a non-romantic way, just practically about the domestic economy and about everything that's going on. And that keeps people tied to each other and updated. And so that's sort of your minimal commitment level if you don't want things to deteriorate. Part of the reason our eyes are the way they are, they have whites. Mm-hmm. That's an evolved adaptation so that we can see what other people's eyes are up to.
Interesting.
And everyone who didn't have visible whites, either died or was killed or didn't mate, right? And so I want to see where you're pointing your eyes because you're devoting a tremendous amount of cortical energy to that value specification. And if I can see what you're pointing your eyes at, then I know what you value. Then I can mimic your body with my body and we can fall into the same, what would you say, the same
rhythm.
game? Yeah, the same rhythm.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's true in relationships too. And I think that as we atomize ourselves in our relationships, I think the relationships break down. That you have to have that rhythm, and you also have to have the ability to.
That's why you dance with your partner.
Yeah, that refusal to acknowledge the differences that you have with your partner.
There's this idea in neurophysiology called the component process. So if you want to move your hand really smoothly this way, you can do it like that. But it's nowhere near as smooth as if you do this. You can be absolutely precise. So you really tense this hand against this hand, and then This one relents a little bit. It's absolute precision. And so that adversarial process, you imagine that women and men are slightly different temperamentally, or even quite a bit different. Well, you're trying to hit the mark, but the mark moves. And so how do you hit it? Well, you hit it with this adversarial process. And you do that with kids. And when you're negotiating in the house too, it's like, well, you think this and I think this. See, my wife has a more masculine temperament than me, and she's really low in politeness, which is an aspect of agreeableness. And it makes her quite formidable as a combatant. And sometimes she'll say things that are so outrageous that, well, it usually makes me laugh. Like in an intense fight, she'll say like 3 of the worst insults you could possibly imagine, and it'll make me laugh. And it's hard sometimes to deal with her because of this more aggressive element. But it was also something that really attracted me towards her, because she's no pushover. And she's got this, she's got a kind of a knife-like sense of humor that comes out quite often. And so I really like the combative element to it. And that's part of what keeps a relationship dynamically alive. I taught a lot about hero mythology to my students, and the women would sometimes come up and say, well, what about the female heroes? And so, well, that's complicated, because you have the image of Mary, and that's pretty maternal, but in Christianity, Christ is also the redeemer of women, and that's an adventurous hero in some sense. It's like, so the female situation is complicated, right? Because there is this adventurous spirit, but it has to be combined with this maternal fecundity, let's say, and involuntarily. Well, what I really liked about Beauty and the Beast, and I do think that's the best Disney movie ever made, was that it's a real female hero myth. The woman, Beauty, is beautiful, so she's high up in the female dominance hierarchy, but she's witty and well-read and intelligent and adventurous and brave and courageous and truthful, all of that. And she doesn't fall for Gaston, the psychopathic persona. And young women are much more likely to fall for men like that, by the way, than women who are slightly more, what would you say?
Mature.
And wiser. So they'll fall for dark triad men, and that's partly how psychopathy propagates itself across the generations. Right? They can be enticed by psychopathic personas. But she prefers the Beast. It's like, well, the Beast is the adventure. It's like, well, is this terrible man, like he's rough, but he's got potential. Right? And that's what really attracts her. And she wants someone who can guard the walls and make a safe haven for the children, but who is generous enough who's productive enough to be useful and generous enough to share. And so she civilizes him. And that's, you say, well, that's the female hero myth. It's like the civilizing of men is the female hero myth. And the civilizing of nature, in some sense, is the male hero myth. Because we have a real question in our culture. We have a more elaborated narrative of, let's say, call it masculine heroism, and a more differentiated sense of masculine totalitarianism as well. The female role is still somewhat undifferentiated, and I think that's hardly not acceptable anymore.